They thought she was just a girl. The truth left the police speechless. The city breathed like an old beast, long used to pain. Dampness clung to the concrete. Horns blared out of sync. Voices got caught in the rush. District 7 was like that. An organism of its own, forgotten, surviving. Most people there didn't expect things to get better. They only hoped to make it home alive at the end of the day. In the middle of it all, she walked. A yellow dress, simple, wrinkled from the heat. Cheap sandals, a cloth bag slung over her shoulder, eyes alert but unhurried. She moved as if she were part of the scenery. And in a way, she was. That was her territory. Not the way others saw it, but the way she knew it. Streets where bodies had fallen. Buildings hiding dirty deals. Police stations protecting profits, not people. She blended in with the street vendors, the sellers of fake chips, the boys balancing bags of ice on their heads. She observed without looking curious, trained not to be noticed, and experienced enough to pick up everything, every face marked by fear, every street reeking of injustice. But that day, she wanted something simple: to walk without being recognized, to eat without being escorted, to feel the city like any other citizen. Then she felt it, the smell, spices in the air, onion, garlic, cilantro, dough frying with care, a smell that made her stomach clench and for a moment silenced the world. She followed the aroma to its source. There he was, an old cart, a makeshift griddle, a dented pot on a gas tank tied with wire, old Joachim. The man was small, stooped, with hands that looked carved from stone. He moved with precision, like someone who knew every second of his craft. He folded the momos delicately, set them on the griddle, turned them with a handmade tong. He sweated heavily but smiled faintly when he handed over the paper bag to his customers. No rush, no show. She stopped and watched from afar. To the left, a mirrored glass building. To the right, a vacant lot. The old man stood in the middle of a social void, invisible, tolerated, but never embraced. Two construction workers in line, a mother with a child, and a delivery guy still holding his helmet. All waited in silence, resigned to the way things worked. She joined the line, pulled coins from the pocket of her dress, kept her eyes down, but missed nothing. The reflection of the cars, the movement around her, the blind spots. It was almost a game she played better than anyone. That's when she heard it, the engine sound, not one, but three. Old patrol cars, faded paint, broken sirens. They rounded the corner like dogs sniffing meat, stopped abruptly in front of the cart. 4 cops got out, 3 ordinary, 1 different. Carlos Ramirez, sunglasses on even in the shade, slicked back hair, posture of a man who's never contradicted. The type who got used to being feared, not for merit, but for violence. He walked up to the old man. No aggressive gesture at first, just the tone, just the way he invaded the other's space, uninvited, like someone sniffing a dish before paying for it. The old man tried to smile, offered something, maybe a momo, maybe his dignity. Ramirez ignored it. In the back, the delivery guy slowly backed away. One of the construction workers pretended to take a call. The woman with the child crossed the street without looking back. The line vanished. Only she remained. The woman in the yellow dress, body still, breathing steady. Ramirez began his ritual, first a finger pointing at the can of coins, then the gesture for the pocket, then the old man's refusal, and then the first slap, quick, across the ear. The cart shook. One officer kicked a wheel. Another pulled the cooler of sodas and tossed it to the ground. Bottles rolled across the hot asphalt. The old man tried to recover. Mistake. Ramirez shoved him hard. The frail body fell to his knees. Greasy hands reached for support. Another kick in the ribs. This wasn't just extortion, it was humiliation. She stepped forward. The yellow dress moved like a banner. She didn't speak, Didn't scream. She just stood between the old man and the cop, arm outstretched, eyes locked. Ramirez looked at her with puzzlement and disdain. The slap came like the crack of a whip, hard, fast, precise, across her left cheek. She staggered, tasted metal in her mouth, didn't fall, didn't cry. Her face burned, but her eyes grew even colder. She didn't strike back, she only stared, then turned her back and walked away. The old man stayed on the ground. The cart was overturned. The city moved on. Someone laughed. Another filmed on their phone but never posted. Safer to delete later. The woman disappeared into the narrow streets of the district. She didn't run. She knew this was only the beginning. She crossed 2 avenues, entered an abandoned garage, climbed a rusty staircase, and reached a metal door. The apartment was modest, but functional. The kitchen was basically an archive. The living room, a surveillance hub. The bedroom, a closet with 2 worlds, civilian clothes on one side, immaculate uniforms on the other. She removed the dress carefully. The wrinkles of sweat and dust folded into neat lines. She washed her face with cold water. No painkillers. She felt the full sting. She needed to. On the wall, a board with faces and dates. Ramirez was already there, next to other names, all tied to complaints that went nowhere, all shielded by a system that cleaned its own filth with silence. She sat at the computer, typed a code. A panel opened. Videos, audios, footage from public cameras, the cooler falling, the punch, the slap across her face. The capture was complete. The hidden mic in her brooch had worked perfectly, and the nearby school cameras had a clear angle. Ramirez's face was sharp. She opened a dossier, marked the date, reviewed the files 3 times, sent encrypted copies to 2 contacts, then grabbed a black-covered binder with hand-marked pages. At the top, a phrase written in red ink: "Rot doesn't get bargained with, it gets exposed." At midnight, she went out onto the balcony. The wind was dry. Below, the city slept, unaware that something had changed. Inside, the old recorder spun. The tape whispered the sound of injustice. And in the mirror, a scarred woman stared at her own reflection, not as a victim, but as someone who had chosen to stop being a spectator. The yellow dress rested on the chair. Tomorrow, it would return to the streets. But now, the war had begun. The main police station of District 7 was a 4-story grey building, with bars on the windows and cameras pointed everywhere, except inward. A place where screams didn't get out through the walls, where bureaucracy smothered any attempt at truth. A place Mariana Silva knew exactly what she would find, and went anyway. She arrived out of uniform, without an escort, without notice. Casual clothes, a light backpack, her face still swollen from the previous day's slap. No one recognized her at first. Eyes slid past her as if she were just another complainant. A tired woman, maybe the mother of someone jailed, maybe a victim of some violence nobody would investigate. That was precisely what she wanted. She went through reception and picked up a form. She filled it out calmly, as if time were on her side. But it wasn't. She knew that. The system would start to react as soon as she made the first move. She sat in a blue plastic chair under a broken fan. On the wall, a poster read, "Report Abuses." Beneath it, a strip of electrical tape covered the word corruption. They called her name, but not by title. Just Mariana Silva. SAO Roberto Sanchez's office was cramped, dimly lit, with a crooked crucifix on the wall and an air conditioner that blew warm air. Sanchez was a broad man, in a tight suit, with a lazy look. He knew that room better than his own house. There, he decided who lived, who was forgotten, who deserved to be heard. Mariana handed him the form. Sanchez read it with disdain, then leaned back in his chair as if he were about to hear a story he'd heard 1,000 times. She pointed to the bruise on her face. She opened her backpack, took out printed images, video stills, copies of the audio, everything millimeter precise and organized. Sanchez didn't look. He said they needed concrete evidence. She pushed the pictures forward, showed the recording where Inspector Ramirez extorted, cursed, assaulted, showed the moment the slap echoed down the street. Silence. Sanchez took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly. Then he pushed the papers back toward her. Said the station system was down for digital registration, and that, without formal witnesses, the report couldn't be accepted. Mariana didn't move. She just looked at him, long, direct, without blinking. Sanchez held her gaze for a few seconds. Then he lowered his voice and said that sometimes it's better to let certain things pass. That the city was complicated, that she didn't know who she was messing with, and finally, that this won't lead anywhere. She smiled, not with joy, with confirmation. She stood up slowly, didn't pick the papers back up, left everything there scattered across the desk like a mute threat, walked out without saying a word. In the hallway, an intern glanced at her from the corner of his eye. He recognized the face. It took him a second to understand who she was. Mariana Silva, the superintendent, the woman who signed the toughest reports, the one responsible for arresting police in other districts. But in that moment, she was just a shadow passing between locked doors. On the way out, the reception guard looked at her differently. The radio clipped to his waist hissed with codes. One of the codes was about her. He knew they were watching now. She knew she couldn't return there anytime soon. She left the building and walked to a taxi, gave a fake address, got out 2 blocks later, went into a pharmacy, bought gauze, hydrogen peroxide, and an energy drink. Then she disappeared into the alleys. That night, she went to the most unlikely place. Old Joaquim's house. The shack sat in the back of an urban occupation. A tin roof, a yard with buckets, a one-eyed cat. The old man sat on a stool with an ice pack on his chest. When he saw her, he tried to close the door. She raised her hand slowly, took her phone from her pocket, showed him the video, showed his face being hit, showed her own injured face. Then she turned the phone off. She asked for nothing. She only handed him an envelope with blood test results, prescriptions, printed images, all the documents he would never be able to manage on his own. He didn't say anything, just took a deep breath. His hands trembled. She left the envelope on the stool and walked away without waiting for an answer. Later, back home, Mariana began to put the plan together. There was no longer any doubt. The system was contaminated from top to bottom. Any attempt at an internal complaint would be stifled. The local internal affairs was compromised. The prosecutor's office wouldn't act without robust evidence and visibility. So she decided she would make everything public, not through the traditional press, but directly into the right hands. She would need 3 things: time, redundant evidence, and an ally who couldn't be bought. She typed a code into her phone. A name popped up: DC Alejandro Torres. Torres was the director of internal control at the Security Secretariat, one of the few who hadn't sold out. He knew Mariana well and knew she never bluffed. She sent a short, encrypted message. "I have evidence. I need to meet you in person. It's urgent." In the other tab, she began assembling a dossier with images, dates, coordinates. She separated the images from the previous day, cross-checked them with footage from the city cameras, and isolated the files. Then she saved everything to 2 different USB drives, hid one in a false panel in a cabinet, and put the other in an insulated bag with ice, along with old baby bottles she used as bait. It was a plan, clean, simple, impossible to trace if done right. The next day would be decisive, but first she had to make sure old Joaquim would be there. She wrote a handwritten note, deliberately shaking her handwriting, folded it and put it in a brown envelope. The next morning, she would give it to the only kid in the favela who still trusted her. No name, just a message. "You deserve to see justice standing." Before bed, she checked the mirror. The purple on her face had darkened. She applied an ointment, adjusted her hair. Then she went to the shelf and took the yellow dress, folded it carefully, not to wash, but to store. It had done its job. The next day, she would wear a uniform and her full name. The building where Alejandro Torres worked wasn't surrounded by bars, but by invisible layers of politics. Almost no one went in without a reason, and those who came out rarely returned with answers. It was there that internal investigations died of natural causes, bureaucracy, convenience, or fear. Mariana arrived early, a dark blazer covering the bruises, hair tied back, documents organized in a black folder. She didn't go through the front. She slipped into the underground parking lot where one of the cameras had a blind spot. That's where she met Torres, as planned. He looked older than the last time they'd seen each other. Deep eye bags, scruffy beard, wrinkled suit. But his gaze was still steady. He was a man who had lost battles, but not the war. Without greetings, she handed him the folder. He flipped through it for 10 minutes without speaking. There were images, reports, dates, GPS records, synchronized footage with audio, everything assembled with the precision of a public indictment. Mariana hadn't brought an accusation. She had brought a complete case. Torres closed the folder and exhaled deeply, said this couldn't stay internal. If it were filed through traditional channels, it would disappear in 2 days. Mariana confirmed. She had already tried, already been silenced. He suggested involving state internal affairs, the press, maybe the ministry. Mariana disagreed. She said she would expose everything directly, in public. No intermediaries, no filters. She wanted a press conference with journalists, politicians, prosecutors, and the people. She wanted Inspector Ramirez to watch his name collapse in front of the cameras. She wouldn't accept backroom deals. Torres hesitated, said it could put her life at risk. She answered with an empty stare. It wasn't about risk. It was about justice. He gave in. They would set it for the next day, noon, in the central auditorium. He would handle logistics, security, the media's presence. She would handle the rest. Leaving the building, Mariana knew the clock had begun ticking, not toward her, against her. The city didn't forgive those who broke the pact of silence. That night, the warning came. Her car was parked 2 blocks from home. When she found it, all 4 tires were flat. The body was scratched with red letters. Rat. The windshield cracked, but nothing stolen, nothing beyond the message. It was clear she had been identified. The disguise of the yellow dress no longer worked. She called a locksmith, replaced the tires, drove to a covered garage and abandoned the car there, took a rideshare app with a fake name, went home by another route, swapped her SIM card, restarted her phone in safe mode. Every step was calculated. She knew more would come. And they did. The next morning, the apartment door was ajar. The lock forced. No mess, no sign of robbery. Just one detail. The wall mural with the names of corrupt cops had been smeared over with black paint. Thick, foul-smelling. Only one photo remained, hers, with a red X across the face. She didn't call reinforcements, didn't alert anyone. She simply turned on the kitchen camera, backed up the files to an external hard drive, and left the house with a backpack. She stopped at a childhood friend's house, dropped off the cat and her personal documents, asked her not to say anything to anyone. The friend didn't ask why. At 11:40 a.m., Mariana arrived at the auditorium. Torres was already there, sweating under his jacket, trying to coordinate the media's entrance. 2 politicians from the security committee were present, 4 reporters with cameras, an internal affairs team, 2 prosecutors' aides, and discreetly in the back of the audience, old Joaquim. The old man wore a clean shirt, glasses patched with tape, and eyes full of doubt. He carried in his pocket the handwritten note Mariana had sent him. No one knew his name, no one recognized him, but he was there, as a symbol. At 12:05, Mariana stepped onto the stage. She wore the official uniform, badges, insignia, the superintendency armband, the bruise from the slap still visible. The crowd fell silent the moment she took the microphone. She didn't start with a speech. She started with the video. On the big screen, in absolute silence, the minutes of the assault unfolded. The arrival of the patrol cars, the shove, the punch, the slap across her face, the shouts, the street noise, everything captured clearly, everything irrefutable. Ramirez's voice demanding money, the public humiliation of old Joaquim, the silent despair of those who never expected justice. At the end of the video, Mariana only said, "This is the state, this is the system, and this is me. The only difference is that I came back." Before anyone spoke, she handed the prosecutor a full physical dossier with both printed and digital copies. Then she turned to Torres and asked for the floor to address the press. She spared no names, no dates. She cited every buried complaint, every denied police report, every ignored victim. She exposed the extortion network run by Ramirez inside the precinct. Said everything had been covered up with the consent of SAO Roberto Sanchez, who would also be held accountable. Across the room, reporters typed frantically. Cameras recorded everything, no editing, no censorship. And in the middle of the room, old Joaquim wept silently, hands clenched on his knees. Torres ended the press conference with a direct order: immediate suspension of all involved, opening of disciplinary proceedings, and referral to the prosecutor's office. He declared in front of the cameras that justice begins here, and it will be relentless. When Mariana stepped down from the stage, flashes still popped, but she didn't look at the journalists. She walked to old Joaquim, sat beside him. They stayed silent. Just two survivors watching the system choke on its own filth. The next morning, the papers hit the stands earlier than usual. Their headlines left no room for flourish. Police superintendent assaulted by her own men, exposes corruption network in historic press conference. Yellow dress, slap across the face, explosive dossier, Mariana Silva becomes a symbol of resistance. Inspector Ramirez suspended, may face arrest this week. In messaging groups, the videos spread like wildfire across dry fields. They weren't edits. They weren't rumors. They were raw records. The woman in uniform, naming names, showing evidence, dismantling an entire system before a silent audience. Mariana wasn't there to negotiate. She was there to make sure no one could pretend not to know. At 9 a.m., the gates of the central precinct were shut. Direct order from DC Torres. An internal affairs team occupied every office on the administrative floor. Phones seized, computers sealed, drawers opened, lockers searched. Ramirez arrived at 9:20, confident, sunglasses on, coffee in hand. By 9:33, he was led out in handcuffs. He didn't shout, didn't fight back. But for the first time, there was panic in his eyes. Not for what was happening, but because he knew what was coming. There was nowhere left to hide. The system that had protected him was now filled with cameras and spotlights. Meanwhile, Mariana stayed silent. She gave no interviews, answered no questions, made no speech. She returned to the superintendency headquarters and shut her office door with a clear warning. Justice isn't negotiated, it's executed. Her name circulated across social media, but she used none of it. She knew the real impact wasn't in trending topics, but in people's faces, in the eyes of mothers at the clinic line, in the nods from delivery riders at the corner, in the whispered comments of public servants who had bowed their heads until yesterday. That's where change began. That afternoon, the Secretary of Public Security called an emergency meeting, mandatory attendance for all district commanders. Mariana walked in last. No one met her eyes, but everyone knew who she was. She spoke briefly, handed in a simple report, said there was no more room for cover-ups, that the Ramirez case was only the surface, that District 7 had been under investigation long before, that she had more names, and that the next steps would depend on courage or complicity. She left the meeting without waiting for a response. On her way out, the prosecutor who had received her dossier stopped her, told her old Joachim had been called to give formal testimony and, even trembling, confirmed everything. Said the old man wanted no compensation, no apologies. He just wanted to know if he could go back to selling his momos in peace. Mariana didn't answer. That night she walked again through the district streets. No disguise, no uniform, no escort. She wore the same yellow dress. People looked, some turned away, others stared with respect. A boy recognized her and shouted her name to his grandmother. A young man offered her a bottle of water without saying a word. She didn't smile, didn't thank him, didn't pose. She just walked. She turned the corner by the technical school and, as if time had rewound, there was the Momo cart, clean, shining, and behind it, old Joachim, in a pressed white shirt, steady hands on the griddle. They looked at each other for a few seconds. There was no more fear in his eyes, only a kind of gratitude that needed no words. He handed her a paper bag with 3 momos, wrapped carefully, and nodded. She took it, set the coins on the tin can, and kept walking. The city was still dirty, unequal, cracked, but for one night, on one street, in one gesture, something had changed, and no one could ever pretend they hadn't seen it. If this story moved you, leave a like. It's the simplest way to show it's still worth fighting for what's right. And if you want to see more stories like this one, subscribe. The next may be even more real than it seems.